I want to tell you a couple of more stories about that ranch in Cody that I worked on. I told you that my job was get up in the mornings and milk 7 cows and again in the evening. uh, After we milked, then I had, my job was, well, go in and have my weenies and eggs. And then my job was to separate the milk from the cream. So you pour the milk into the separator, and then you start turning the thing, and it separates the cream from the milk by centrifugal force. So the cream goes out one spout, and the milk goes out another one. There was this. We had an actually little milk house that was just for that. There was a door you go into, of course. There's a separator. And then it had a pretty good sized window with a table in front of it, like a church table. And so when I would turn the separator, I didn't want to just look into a blank wall, so I mostly, to see outside, I would have to do it with my left hand. No problem. But even today, my left tricep is bigger than my right from doing that. But one day I was doing this, and the lady was home. She'd been gone for about a month selling insurance someplace. And she was out there. There's a big lilac bush by the window. And she was out there scratching around and said, hollered in through the window saying, "Raymond, there is a rattlesnake here by this bush, but I can't find him. I can hear him. Would you look through the window and see if you can see him down in between the shed and the bush?" So I went over there, and I could hear him. Man, was he rattling. So I'm looking down there on the thing. I said, "Well, I don't see him." And I kept looking, and she kept looking, and I backed up a little bit to do something, and I saw the snake. He was on the windowsill on my side of the window. The only space between us was the width of that table, which I was leaning over. Why he didn't get me, I don't know.
Oh, jeez.
But I almost had to go to the laundry when I saw him. Then one day, she sent me down in the cellar. The cellar was a big hole that was dug, and they roofed it over, and then they piled the dirt on top of it to make sure the temperature in the wintertime and never got to freeze the stuff that they stored, which was all bottled vegetables from their garden. They had a huge garden. That's why I spent all the time weeding. So she said, "Raymond, go down there and get a can of something, bottle." Well, I knew there were snakes all around. And the only light was when you opened the cellar door, which was kind of at a 45-degree angle. Well, that was the only light. So I walked down in there, stood in the middle of the floor, looking around till I finally spied the bottle I wanted. And then the question was, how do I get it? Because I didn't want a snake to get me when I put my hand up on the bottle. So I studied it and didn't hear anything, and finally I just snatched it and ran out the door. And by golly, we counted 7 rattlesnakes crawling away from that cellar.
Oh,
I had disturbed them. Then one day, one afternoon when I was milking the cows, about the fourth cow over was a kicker. So you had to go way around behind her. Their heads are all in a stanchion. But I had to go way around the back of her to make sure she didn't kick me. And in the barn there were about 4 or 5 windows that were probably 3 feet by 3 feet. No screens or anything. In the wintertime they had a board that you put in the window to keep the snow and the cold out so you could milk. But in the summertime they were just propped up against the wall right below the window at about a 45-degree angle. And so when you went to clean out the barn, you could shovel manure out the window. Well, in walking around behind this cow, I thought I saw a movement behind one of those windows leaning up against the wall. But I wasn't sure. So after I milked the cow, I went back and I looked behind that thing, and holy smoke, there was a 37-inch snake there.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I ran out the door. I put the milk where it belonged and ran out the door and hollered for the guy who worked there, and he came, and we shooed the snake out in the open, and then chopped his head off with a shovel. Then in the daytime, after got all the chores done, feeding the chickens and the hogs and the stuff, the old man, his name was Vince Rotter. The old man would look, he could tell the time by looking at the sun. And man, he was pretty accurate. But after we milked the cows, we'd put them out. Now, Sandy and Debbie and Miriam go to Wyoming every year, and as they go past where that farm was, they see nothing but farmlands, which are very nice. When I was there was nothing but sagebrush. There were no farms. They didn't start till after the Japanese relocation center. So the cows, we'd turn them out, and they would go one of 2 directions. Back west, up in the hills a little bit, was a natural spring. So they could go up there and graze around and have water. Or they could go the other way, which is go down a ways and cross under the highway and go down to the Shoshone River, which was quite a ways. Well, he was smart enough in the mornings, he would watch them to see which direction they went. I never thought about it. I always thought they would go up by that spring. So about 3 o'clock, I'd saddle up my horse to go look for them. And he would tell me, well, they went up toward the spring, or they went off probably toward the river. So one day he told me that they went down toward the river. Well, it was quite a ways to the river. I would say a mile or 2. And there was an old vacant house out there. And I thought it housed ghosts. I hated to go by the place. I was so afraid. So I went out there and I started looking for them. And there's no fences. They can go any place. Well, I knew they'd be by the river because that's where water is. But I had no idea which direction they'd go once they got to it, upstream or downstream. Well, I started looking and looking and looking and looking. It finally got dark. I could hardly see. And I'm riding down there on the river bottom, and there's a bank And I didn't want to get too close to the bank because I thought a snake might be in a hole and he'd jump out and get me. But it got really, really dark, and I had no idea where I was going.
Oh, wow.
But as luck would happen, I happened to walk right by where they had bedded down. And as I walked by, the old cow, lead cow, had a bell on her. She turned her head, and I heard the bell go tinkle. So I turned around, and there they were. Now they're very uncomfortable because they should have been milked about 4 or 5 hours ago. Their old bladders are really full. So I herded them out of there and up toward the ranch. And as I got to the highway, he had gotten in his car and he came down the highway looking for me. And he happened to see me as I was right there, so we herded them home. They could hardly walk, and then we milked them. And then in the daytimes, when I'd go out toward that spring, I was always looking for 3 things. The cows plus mushrooms. I said we had weenies and eggs. Generally, I would bring home mushrooms. They grow kind of under a sagebush because they tend to be a fungus that grows out of wood, rotted wood. And so I'd I'd get a dozen mushrooms and bring them home every day. And in the mornings, we would have fried mushrooms in butter, and holy smoke, are that good. Well, one day he came out there while I was looking at that spring. I don't know why he came, but he did. So when we met, we were talking to each other, my horse facing one way and his horse facing the other. Well, the third thing I was always looking for was arrowheads. So we're standing there talking, sitting on our horses, and he looked down by my horse's hind foot, and there was the most beautiful, perfect arrowhead. It was about 2 or 3 inches long I ever saw. Well, unfortunately, he saw it. And unfortunately, he kept it.
Oh.
He later, in that year, went across the river in his wagon and horses, and something happened, and the horses ran off the road, and the wagon tumbled down toward the river, and he got hurt in the head, and he was never the same after that.
Oh.
And then when the lady, she had a sister that worked for a store in Cody called Dave Jones. He sold Western goods, boots and hats and shirts. And this lady's sister worked, and her name was Josephine, I suppose. And come about the 3rd of July, Josephine bought me a real yellow silk cowboy shirt. And the next morning when I got on my horse, I rode into Cody, which is about 5 miles, probably 6 or 7. I rode into Cody so I could be in the parade for the 4th of July rodeo, and I had on my yellow shirt. And I would ride into borrow pits off the side of the highway, and I would see tourists going by heading for Cody, and they'd see this old cowboy over there riding his horse with a bright yellow shirt. Be surprised how many of them slowed down and waved at me. I waved back. Then when I got to Cody, the parade started. I got in the parade, and the parade winds up in the rodeo grounds, and all those who are in the parade get to watch the rodeo for free. That's the end of my story.
Okay. All right.